Right, last time I told you that the scientific revolution is the foundation for something that comes a little bit later that the chapter discusses, and that's the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is one of the most important movements in world history and certainly in European history. And it's one of the major causes for the Age of Revolution that we'll talk about later on in our next unit. The early Enlightenment is an intellectual, it's a cultural movement that brings the scientific revolution into really our everyday lives, questioning some of the things that we have accepted about government, about ourselves. So it's really a culmination of the scientific revolution challenging science. Now we're going to start challenging other things using those same ideas, reason. The early Enlightenment goes all the way back to the beliefs of Pierre Bayle, who was a French Huguenot. He believed that nothing could actually ever be really known beyond all doubt. Then you have Spinoza, who was excommunicated from the Jewish faith. God and nature were two things or two of the same thing. That was really two names for exactly the same thing. And then Locke. John Locke is the most important figure in the Enlightenment for several reasons for us. He'll be a major influence on the age of revolution later on. But in education, he's also really important because of his essay on human understanding, or essay concerning human understanding, sorry, that explains how we learn, that we learn from experience, that we learn by experiencing things. And from those experiences, we form our own ideas. Some of the Enlightenment thinkers will begin to call into question things like government and what's the best form of government and try to answer that. Thomas Hobbes, who is actually sort of pre-Enlightenment but kind of foreshadows what we're going to talk about a little bit later on, wrote in his Leviathan in 1651 that when Hobbes was writing about us, he thought we were all bad, that because of original sin, that we're just terrible. And if we're left on our own, we'll destroy each other. The strong will conquer the weak. So Hobbes believed, because of that, that we need the strongest form of government possible to keep us in line. And for him, that was that was absolute monarchy. But Hobbes never believed in things like divine right. Hobbes believed that because we are so bad, that we need the strongest form of government possible. But we make the government, not some divine being. That God doesn't come from the divine, it comes from us in sort of a contract between us and the government. The When Hobbes talks about that, then you're actually sort of applying some of these scientific ideas, reason, to government. And in Hobbes's view, absolute monarchy is the or the best form of government, but it does not have divine right, that it comes from us. John Locke is a English philosopher, thinker. In 1690, he publishes his two treatises on government. Again, Locke believes that government is a contract. But in Locke's view, government was there to protect our natural rights, which he said were life, liberty, and property. And Locke believed that that's the government's only purpose. We get together to form a government to protect ourselves and to protect our rights, and that's the government's duty. If it fails, then we have the right to toss that government out and start over, which, of course, later on will be a major reason for things like the American Revolution. Locke was actually writing to justify what the English had done during the Glorious Revolution, to justify this move towards constitutional monarchy. Locke believed that we were pretty good, that we could govern ourselves, and that we could form a government that would be important, or a government that would protect our natural rights. Now, this is a great example of how we start applying Enlightenment ideas and principles to things like government. Okay? Now, they will go on. Okay? The guys like Montesquieu and Voltaire that you'll read about, they all do the same thing as well. They will oftentimes write about what the best form of government is. Montesquieu was a French nobleman, believed that separation of powers was the best form of. Now remember, he is French, so the French government is absolute, and he has to deal with that on every day, and believe that the best form of government would actually separate powers, so that you would have a balanced form of government. We borrow a lot from that when we write our Constitution, and an admirer of the English system. Most famous work, The Persian Letters, was a satire that was critical of governments from. He wrote about governments from a foreign perspective, and criticized things like royal absolutism as well. Voltaire is always considered to be the best example of the Enlightenment philosopher. He was a thinker, he was a man of science, he was a philosopher, he was a teacher, he was a champion of individual liberty. So Voltaire was, in a lot of ways, a reformer. Now, Voltaire, that's not his real name, by the way. His real name is Jacques Marie Arouet, but he writes a he pens a critique of government or of a individual person, and it gets him thrown in jail. And so he learned a valuable lesson: write under a pen name, under an assumed name, and he writes satire like many of these to protect their identities. Voltaire believed that we could better ourselves. He was a firm believer in man's ability to improve, but we had to reject certain things in order to do that. Voltaire will be a firm attacker of religion. That doesn't mean that he was not religious or that he was atheistic. He's not. Voltaire, though, did not like organized religion because he felt like it limited your ability to think for yourself. Voltaire believed instead in a religious philosophy called deism. Many of the Enlightenment philosophers would be deists. There is a God, but God does not interfere in the affairs of mankind. Prayer, organized religion are worthless because God is not going to interfere. God is a remote God. God set the universe into motion and it now works like a machine. Go back and think about what I said when we talked about Newton, that really this was the way that many of these Enlightenment philosophers could justify the existence of God, but at the same time be men of science and be men of reason. So this is, and by the way, deism is very popular and it spreads even here to America for guys like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who would be deists as well. The This idea of using reason, all right, is really important. The It goes on to talk about, or we will go on to talk about things like the encyclopedia, that applying this to other things like economics, for example. It's not just government, it's not just religion. The Enlightenment brings into question and questions many of our long held beliefs. So, the Enlightenment, remember, is this intellectual movement, and all of these guys are champions of reason. The Rousseau, later on, Jean Jacques Rousseau, would be, in his social contract, would be one of the believers that government was here to protect our general will, that we should, as masses, be able to enjoy government and be a part of government. Voltaire, who, despite I told you about being the most important example of the philosophers, didn't believe that the uneducated could participate in government. So Voltaire actually believed that the best form of government would be an enlightened monarchy, which the textbook goes on to talk about here in a second. So enlightened despotism in a lot of ways was what Voltaire could hope for, an enlightened monarch that would rule to the best of our ability. But Rousseau believed that the masses could and should govern and should be part of government. And that's sort of a different idea. The Diderot was one of the last Enlightenment philosophers that I'm going to talk about. He was responsible for compiling a tremendous amount of the Enlightenment thought into an encyclopedia full of new knowledge. It was immediately attacked by the church and by government. And Diderot once said that man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. And what he's talking about here is that these two things, whether it be absolute monarchy or organized religion, were the things that limited the way that we could think. Go back and think about what I told you guys about with Copernicus and Galileo, who came under fire and were even persecuted by the church for their scientific beliefs. And Diderot's encyclopedia is another example of that. The really, the textbook goes on to talk about the Enlightenment in Scotland, the Enlightenment in Prussia with Immanuel Kant, and the Enlightenment in Italy with Beccaria. So go and you can read about that and see how the Enlightenment spread. But one of the things is that as we have become more global, and as we've seen that through our first three chapters, we've also talked about how things are spreading back to Europe. The As we start to see more of the world, you see Europeans change with their perception. Some will embrace Confucianism from China. Some will debate Islamic culture. Some will debate New World culture. So, as we come to this bigger picture of the world, we now have to kind of think about the things that are outside of Europe as well. The definitions of race are discussed in the chapter, how we classified plants and animals. Should we classify humans as well? And are some groups superior or inferior to others? The uh, the debate about women in the Enlightenment is important. Should in some places women were allowed to participate, others they were not. They could not meet with males to discuss the Enlightenment. They in other places they could. Some were very key to the development of the Enlightenment. So you can read about that as well. The chapter sort, and this is the Salon, by the way. The last sort of part of the chapter deals with this concept I told you about from Voltaire about enlightened absolutism. And if you read about that, you'll get to see enlightened monarchy, monarchs influenced by the Enlightenment in several places. One in Prussia under Frederick the Great, one in Russia under Catherine the Great, one in Austria under Maria Theresa. So read about those and think about what I told you guys about with this notion of having an Enlightenment product, an Enlightenment monarch, use their power for the benefit of the people that they rule. And you'll see that in Prussia, in Russia, and in Austria with Maria Theresa. The uh, the last part of the chapter talks about the the changes that are taking place in the Atlantic world here. That here in America, sugar and tea are becoming major products, but to produce them, slavery becomes a major issue. Many of the Enlightenment thinkers would take a stand against slavery, while others kind of worked on that superior inferior debate and believed that there were slaves that could be inferior and thus could be used for work. So the French colonies would use slavery in the Caribbean, the Spanish would use it, and of course the English would use it as well. So understand how slavery sort of fits into this bigger world. This is what we used to call the old triangle trade, where goods would move here to Africa, be exchanged for slaves that would be brought to the New World, and then goods from the New World like sugar, tobacco, and other things would be brought back to Europe. So it makes this triangle that we used to discuss as the old triangle trade. That is really important. The Atlantic trade is a big deal. Okay. And the textbook sort of finishes up talking about the Enlightenment making its way into everyday life. So make sure that you read this and take into account all of these Enlightenment ideas, and because they're very important. We'll see them again later when we talk about the Age of Revolution.